Ever catch yourself watching one of those courtroom dramas, the ones, and wondering, okay, but like, what about all the things that go into deciding someone's sentence? It's like rarely just guilty or not guilty out in the real world, right?
No, absolutely not. You hit the nail on the head. The law has to consider that people's actions, they don't happen in some kind of vacuum. And that's where things get super interesting.
Right, exactly. And that is exactly what we are diving into today. Mitigating circumstances in criminal law. Specifically, we're looking at the Philippines Revised Penal Code.
Fascinating stuff.
You shared some excerpts with me from Article 13, and oh my goodness, this is some dense stuff, but that's why you've got us.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm here for, to break it down. At the heart of it, it's about understanding that sometimes a person's choices, their actions, they're influenced by things outside of their control, internal struggles. And the law, believe it or not, in its own way, it recognizes that.
Exactly. It's like getting a behind the scenes look at how a magic trick works. It's not about letting anyone off the hook, not at all. It's more like figuring out how all the gears turn, legally speaking, when it comes to punishment.
It's about making sure the punishment, it fits not only the crime, but also all of the circumstances surrounding that crime.
Proportionality.
Okay, so I guess first things first, for those who might not know, what are mitigating circumstances? Like, what do they actually mean when we talk about the law? So in the simplest terms possible, think of them as factors that can actually reduce a criminal sentence, right? The idea is sometimes someone's freedom of action is kind of diminished, maybe their intent is limited, or they demonstrate something the law calls lesser perversity.
Lesser perversity. Okay, hold on. Now you have to give me an example because that sounds kind of intense.
Sure, sure. Let's say, hypothetically, someone commits a crime, but they do it because of extreme provocation from the victim. Now, obviously, that doesn't make the crime okay, but the law recognizes that the intense emotions, they play a role. It's different than a planned, calculated act. So that's where lesser perversity might come into play.
So it's like acknowledging that we don't always act perfectly rationally, that emotions sometimes they kind of take over.
Exactly, exactly. And that is actually a key insight into how these mitigating circumstances work. They add like a layer of nuance to the justice system.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. So we've got these mitigating circumstances, but it sounds like they're not all created equal. The excerpts that you shared mention ordinary ones versus privileged ones. What's the difference there?
Yeah, so you can kind of think about it like levels of intensity, right? Ordinary mitigating circumstances are factors that can reduce the penalty, sure, but they can also be canceled out by what the law calls aggravating factors.
Yeah.
They can be negated.
Oh, interesting. So it's kind of like a legal tug of war then.
Exactly. You got it.
Okay. I need an example, though, just to wrap my head around it. How might that work in a real case?
Okay, imagine this. You've got someone who steals, right, but they're stealing out of desperation because their family is starving. So that circumstance, that difficult situation, it might make the court more lenient. But here's the catch. If they used violence during that theft, well, now that aggravating factor, that could outweigh the leniency they'd get for the difficult circumstances.
Oh, wow. So it really is this balancing act that the courts have to do.
I feel like so.
But what about the other type, those privileged mitigating circumstances? Those sound way more powerful based on the name alone.
Oh, you're telling me these privileged ones, they're like the VIPs of the legal world, like they get to cut to the front of the line every time. They always reduce the penalty by 1 or 2 degrees, no matter what other factors might be going on. It's the law saying in these specific situations, leniency is always, always warranted.
Okay, now those are the cases I want to hear about. What kind of situations are we talking about where someone would automatically get that leniency?
Well, one of the most common ones, believe it or not, is age. The law, it makes special provisions for offenders who are very young or very old, and it comes down to their capacity, really, their capacity to understand or control their actions.
That makes sense. Like you're not going to throw the book at a 12-year-old the same way you would at a 30-year-old.
Exactly, exactly. Or, on the flip side, if you're dealing with someone who's over 70, the law acknowledges that, chances are, they pose less of a threat, or there might be other considerations to take into account.
Speaking of age, you mentioned that being over 70 is a pretty big deal in the Philippine legal system. Something about how it was even more significant when the death penalty was still a possibility there.
Oh, absolutely. Back then, if you were over 70, we're talking literally the difference between a death sentence and life in prison. It was a major mitigating circumstance.
Wow. Okay, that really puts it into perspective. It's like the law saying we're not going to disregard a lifetime of experiences even if a crime was committed.
That's a good way to put it. It's acknowledging that justice, True justice. It's not just about like punishment as an end in itself, but finding what response is actually appropriate considering everything.
I'm starting to realize just how much more complex this all is than it seems. It's not black and white like it sometimes seems. Not at all.
Not even close. And honestly, we've only just scratched the surface here. There are so many fascinating examples of how these circumstances actually play out in real life cases.
Well, now you've got me wanting to hear more. Let's dive into some of those case studies, see how this actually works in action. What do you say we start with that one about the robbery that went wrong, the one you mentioned earlier?
All right, yeah, let's get into that robbery
Yeah.
case. That one, it really gets to the heart of intent, which surprisingly is a very tricky thing in the eyes of the law.
Oh, I can imagine. Like, how do you even begin to prove what someone was thinking in the moment a crime was happening?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a $1 million question, right? And it's a huge challenge for prosecutors, for sure. And it's also, honestly, where these mitigating circumstances get really, really interesting. So this case, right? Yeah. You've got a planned robbery, things go sideways, as they often do, and someone ends up dead. So on the surface, you might think, okay, open and shut case, right?
Yeah. Someone died during a robbery. That, to me at least, sounds like it's pretty clear cut. What's the mitigating factor? What else is there to consider?
Well, the key here, the whole thing hinges on whether that death, if it was actually intended, or if it was a horrible accident, tragic accident. That just happened during a different crime.
Oh, okay. So it's like the difference between going in with the plan to kill versus someone dying because of something that happened during the robbery.
You got it. Exactly, because the law, right, it tries to be fair, at least in theory. It doesn't punish a tragic outcome the same way it punishes, cold-blooded premeditation. So the court, they had to figure out, did this person intend to kill or did someone die during a robbery? Those are two very different things.
Okay, no, that makes sense. It also seems incredibly hard to prove to get into someone's head like that. So how do they even figure that out?
Well, it really comes down to the specifics of each case. The court's going to look at everything. Witness testimony, any signs of a struggle, forensic evidence, all of that, to see if they can connect those dots. Was this death a direct result of the accused's actions, or was it a tragic accident? Unintentional.
So in this specific case, what did they decide?
In this case, they actually found that, yeah, the death was connected to the robbery, but it wasn't a direct result of what the accused meant to do. It was a crazy situation, lots of chaos. And yeah, the death happened during a struggle, but ultimately they ruled that the accused didn't go in intending to kill.
Wow, okay. It's cases like this that really make you, or at least make me, rethink those news stories because you kind of, or at least I do, I always just assume the worst, but there's all this other stuff happening behind the scenes we don't see.
Right. And that's the thing. That's the power of understanding these mitigating circumstances. They show you how much goes into deciding, like, what justice means in each situation.
Totally. So in the end, this robber, they didn't exactly get away with it, but they weren't on trial for murder either, right?
Exactly. They still had to answer for what they intended to do, which was robbery, not this horrible but ultimately unintentional outcome. So yeah, I think it's a really good example of how the law tries to walk that line, between being firm, but also hopefully being fair.
Yeah. Okay, that one really makes you think. You mentioned another case before, something about an insult at a fiesta. It sounded like, honestly, kind of a normal thing that could happen, but you made it sound way more serious.
Oh yeah, that case. Man, this is a classic example of how
Yeah.
something that seems, you know, on the surface, like no big deal, it can actually be a grave offense. It all depends on the context.
Okay, so remind me, what happened? This is about vindication of a grave offense, right? That was the mitigating circumstance.
Ding, ding, ding. You got it. So picture this, all right? You're at a fiesta, big celebration, food everywhere, music, tons of people, right? An old man, well respected in the community, goes up to a food stall and asks for some roast pig. Seems harmless enough, right?
Yeah, that just sounds like, standard fiesta procedure. What's wrong with a little roast pig?
Right, exactly. But then the person running the stall, the deceased in this case, they make a joke, you know. But it's at the old man's expense. Something like, yeah, sure, we'll roast you up next.
Oof. Okay, that's a little harsh, especially to an older person. But a grave offense, though, really.
See, that's the thing. You got to remember the context here. This wasn't just some buddies trading jabs. We're talking a public event, a fiesta, which, if you know about Filipino culture, social standing, respect, all that, it's a big deal. This old man, he's publicly humiliated. His dignity, it's been undermined.
So, the insult, it's almost like it was amplified by the situation, the setting, the fact that it was so public.
Exactly, exactly. You're picking up what I'm putting down. And in this case, the court, they agreed. They factored all that in. The old man's social standing, how important fiestas are in the Philippines, the whole respecting your elders thing. It might seem small to some, but in that context, it was a big deal.
Okay, yeah. I'm starting to see how something that might seem, I don't know, like a harmless joke could be a serious offense in the wrong context.
You got it. And that's what makes this case so interesting, right? It shows how the law has to be able to bend a little,
Yeah,
has to consider these cultural and social pieces of the puzzle.
totally. So what happened after the insult? Did the old man just like let it go?
Oh, he did not. Later that day, he runs into the man who insulted him,
Yeah.
and, well, he hits him on the head with an axe.
Whoa, okay. Yeah, I'd say things escalated quickly. That's a pretty extreme reaction, even for a public insult.
It was. And this right here is where the mitigating circumstance comes in. See, the court, they acknowledged, obviously, yeah, what he did was really serious, but they also saw that this old man was acting from this place of, like, deep humiliation. He was trying to, like, get his honor back.
So they saw the insult as a mitigating factor in the assault, even though it wasn't like immediate.
They did. They understood that his actions, as extreme as they were, they came from this place of wounded pride. He felt like he had to defend his honor. And in that social context, it makes a difference.
So I'm guessing he didn't get off scot-free, but like the sentence was less severe because of the insult.
Exactly. The court gets it. They
Yeah.
understood that this wasn't coming out of nowhere.
Man, that's wild. It really shows you just how much goes into these decisions and how important it is to know what's going on beneath the surface.
Oh, it's a whole other world under there.
Yeah.
And this case is a perfect example of that. It reminds us that, like justice, it can't be one size fits all. It has to take into account all these little details of, like, what it means to be human and the cultural context, too.
It's kind of reminding me of those courtroom dramas where you see someone snap after like years of abuse, but we talked about how provocation usually has to be immediate, right? So how does that, like legally speaking, how does that work?
You're right. You're right. It's a good point. It's more nuanced than that. So in those cases, yeah, years of abuse, that wouldn't fly for, like, immediate provocation. But, and this is important, it might point toward a different mitigating circumstance or even a totally different legal defense. It's not a dead end.
Oh, so it's not that the abuse is just ignored, it's that it might be looked at under a totally different legal lens.
Exactly. There are options. The law, as complicated as it can be, it's got ways of dealing with these situations. Might not be provocation, but that doesn't mean the court can't consider what happened.
Okay, that does make me feel a little better knowing that these situations, they aren't just like swept under the rug.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Like I said, the law has its flaws, but it's meant to handle these really complex, nuanced situations.
This is making me think about that other case, the one you mentioned earlier about the guy who ran off to a hotel. That also had to do with timing, right? Like specifically when things happen.
It did. That one is all about how important this idea of voluntariness is, especially when it comes to voluntary surrender, which is the mitigating circumstance we're talking about.
Right, because even thinking about running away, like that probably makes you look guilty.
Well, let's just say it definitely complicates things. In this case, you got this guy, he commits a crime, right? But then he freaks out, gets spooked, and decides to lay low in a hotel. He doesn't call the cops, which, let's be real, not the best look.
Yeah, not exactly screaming remorseful, is it?
Not really. Anyway, so the police, they eventually show up at the hotel, and he doesn't fight it. He confesses the whole thing and surrenders. So now the court has to decide, was this a real, genuine, I'm turning myself in kind of thing, or was this a last-ditch effort to try and get a lighter sentence after he realized he was caught?
Yeah, I can see how that would be a tough one. It's like, yeah, he surrendered, but only after the police were knocking on his door.
Yep, exactly. That's what the court had to figure out. It wasn't a classic textbook case of turning himself in, but it wasn't like he was trying to run or anything.
So which way did they go with it?
In the end, they gave him the mitigating circumstance, but it wasn't an easy call, that's for sure. The court basically said, okay, so maybe he didn't handle this perfectly, but we do see some remorse here, like he owned up to it, which counts for something.
So even in those messy real-life situations where it's not a perfect example of a mitigating circumstance, the law still tries to find some kind of middle ground.
That's the idea, at least.
Yeah.
And honestly, it's what makes this whole area of the law so fascinating to me. It's all about figuring out human behavior, which, as we know, can be messy.
This is really making me realize just how much goes into deciding someone's sentence. It's like you hear about mitigating factors, but you never really think about what they actually mean.
And that's why these deep dives are so important. We're taking these like big abstract legal terms and showing you how they work in the real world, how they can literally mean a longer sentence or a shorter one. Real stakes.
No, totally. And we've covered a lot of ground here. Age, intent, the context of a situation, even if you surrender or not. It's crazy to me how much nuance is built into the system.
It's all about recognizing that no two crimes are the same, no two people are the same. So a justice system that actually works, it's got to take all those little details into account.
Absolutely. And speaking of nuance, what about those mitigating factors that don't fit into a neat little box? You mentioned a catch-all category, like circumstances that are similar in nature to the ones actually listed in the law.
Yeah. That one, now that's where things get really interesting. That's
Yeah.
where the law has to adapt, think on its feet a little bit. That's where the aha moments happen.
Okay, I love a good aha moment. Lay it on me, what kind of mitigating circumstances end up in that catch-all category? Okay, so we're talking catch-all category.
Yeah, I've said
Those
that.
mitigating circumstances that aren't like directly spelled out in the law. It's like the Wild West of the legal system, right?
Yeah.
Where things get a little unpredictable.
It's where the law has to, roll with the punches a bit. Life is messy, and the law has to keep up.
Okay, yeah, no, that's a good point. So give me some examples. What kind of mitigating factors might we see pop up here?
Well, we've actually already touched on a couple. Remember, extreme poverty, like someone stealing because they're desperate to feed their family, or what's it called? Battered woman syndrome.
Huh.
That can be a factor in assault cases, but it goes even deeper than that.
Deeper how? Give me the good stuff.
Think about situations where someone acts under extreme pressure, right? Like they're forced to do something, commit a crime, because someone is threatening them or someone they love.
So they're basically backed into a corner and have to do something they wouldn't normally do, just to protect themselves or someone else.
Exactly. It's like their free will, it's compromised, and the law recognizes that as a mitigating factor. Or, here's another one. Imagine someone has like a diagnosed mental health condition, something that makes it hard for them to control their impulses.
Okay, so if someone has a real legitimate condition and it makes it hard to think straight in the heat of the moment, the court might take that into account when deciding their sentence.
Exactly. It doesn't mean they get a free pass, not at all. The crime still happened, but it helps explain why, especially if there's a clear connection between the condition and what they did.
Right, of course. So it's like with this catch-all category, the law is acknowledging that sometimes people just, I don't know, aren't all there, and that has to be a part of how we figure out what justice looks like.
It's about getting the full picture. You know what I mean? Human behavior, it's complicated, way more complicated than just right and wrong, good and bad.
Totally. It's like we're looking at a tapestry now, not just a single thread. All those little details, all those colors, they come together to make the whole image.
Ooh, I like that analogy. It's about context. And that's what this catch-all category does really well. It gives the courts that freedom to consider all the things that make a case unique,
Yeah.
the things you don't always see at first glance.
This deep dive has really changed how I look at the legal system, honestly. I always thought it was all about following the rules no matter what, but now I'm seeing it's just as much about understanding, the human side of it all.
That's what it's all about, right?
Yeah.
Finding that sweet spot where you're upholding the law, but you're also acknowledging that life, it's messy and people are complicated.
100%. This has been honestly eye-opening. So next time I'm reading a news story about, whatever crime, I'll be thinking about this, about all these mitigating circumstances, trying to see what else might be going on beneath the surface.
That's what I like to hear. Don't jump to conclusions. There's always more to the story. Always.
You've definitely given me a lot to think about. It's like you've unlocked a secret level of the legal system, one most people don't even know is there.
And that's the beauty of it, right? The more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't know.
That is true. Speaking of learning, I think that about wraps up our deep dive into the world of mitigating circumstances.
It does. But like we were just saying, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's always more to learn about the law and how it works.
And that's what makes it so interesting. It's like the law, it's always changing, evolving as we do. So to everyone listening, next time you run into a legal thing, in the news or even in your own life, remember this conversation.
Remember these mitigating circumstances. Don't just look at the surface, dig a little deeper, ask some questions.
Until next time on The Deep Dive, keep those brains turning.